If you're someone easily frightened, this might be the time to skip ahead. But before you do, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. We've got plenty of other horror content that you'll enjoy, and we'd love to have you as part of this community. For those of you who love a good scare and can handle it, stay with me. Story 1. The Night Shift. Grace had always been the type to find solace in solitude. The world was always too loud, too busy. The quiet of the empty hospital corridors was a sanctuary for her. At least it used to be. It was her 3rd month on the night shift as a resident doctor when things started to change. Her hospital was old, built in the early 1900s, and had long since expanded into a modern, state-of-the-art facility. But the original wing remained, a relic of a time when medicine was practiced in dim rooms with gas lamps and whispered prayers. They called it the East Wing, though no one called it by name. Everyone simply referred to it as the Old Ward, a place left to gather dust and silence. Grace was stationed in the new wing. Yet every night her rounds took her past that locked door at the end of the hallway. No one worked there anymore. No patients had been admitted there in decades. Yet the door always drew her attention. She didn't understand why it unsettled her so much. There was nothing behind it, just old rooms and forgotten memories. Or so she thought. One night, just after midnight, she heard it for the first time. She had been making her way through the silent halls, the glow of the sterile white lights casting long shadows on the linoleum floors, when she heard a faint scratching sound. It came from behind the door of the old ward. She stopped, her heart skipping a beat. It was so soft, she could almost convince herself she'd imagined it. Almost. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate scrape, like nails dragging across wood. Grace froze. Her mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a loose vent cover or an animal trapped in the walls. She stepped closer, her feet reluctant to move. Her breath was shallow now, each exhale sharp and cold in the quiet. She pressed her ear to the door. She heard nothing but silence. Then, just as she was about to pull back, there was a single, soft knock on the other side. She recoiled, stumbling back, her heart hammering in her chest. The hallway stretched out before her, endless and empty. And she had this sudden, irrational feeling that, if she stayed there even a moment longer, something terrible would happen. She turned and hurried back to her station, her footsteps echoing far too loudly in the empty corridor. The next night, she tried to convince herself it had been nothing. It's a hospital, and hospitals are full of noises at night. People in other wings, the hum of machines, the groaning of old pipes and the other staffs. But deep down, she knew. She knew that wasn't what she had heard. Still, her shift passed uneventfully. The door at the end of the hall remained as it was, silent, locked, undisturbed. And yet, she felt a weight pressing on her chest every time she passed it. A week went by before the next incident. It was nearly 3 a.m. when the lights began to flicker. At first, she thought it was just a power surge. Hospitals were notorious for their old wiring, but the flickering became more rhythmic, almost like a pulse. And then, without warning, it went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything. Grace stood frozen in place, her hands still on the chart she'd been updating, her fingers clenched around the pen, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. The emergency lights should have kicked in by now. They always did. But not tonight. Tonight, there was only the darkness. She stood in the silence, the air thick and heavy around her. That's when she heard it again. This time it was louder, more insistent, and it was closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood as a wave of nausea rolled through her stomach. There was something unnatural about the sound, something that set her teeth on edge. It was like the scratching wasn't just in the walls, but inside her mind. In the dark, she couldn't see the hallway, but she knew exactly where the old ward was. The sound was coming from behind the door. Her breath quickened, and she felt a primal urge to run, to flee from that place, before whatever was behind that door could find her. And then, the lights came back on. The hallway flickered back into existence, and with it, the scratching stopped. Grace let out a shaky breath, her whole body trembling as she forced herself to walk away from the door. She didn't look back, didn't dare. But the sound of her footsteps felt wrong. They didn't echo like they should have, as though the corridor were muffling them. It was only when she reached the safety of the nurse's station that she realized the pen she'd been holding was broken. The plastic cracked in her grip. The third incident came days later. She hadn't been sleeping well. Every time she closed her eyes, she dreamt of long hallways and locked doors. She would wake up drenched in sweat, the sheets twisted around her body like a noose. That night, as she passed the old ward, she noticed that the door was open. Her heart lurched. It had always been locked. Always. She stood there, staring into the blackness beyond the door. The air coming from the room was cold, far too cold for a hospital. She could feel it on her skin, a biting chill that made her muscles tense. She didn't want to go in. Every fiber of her being screamed not to, but her feet moved of their own accord. The room was empty, just as she had always known it would be. Dust-covered beds and rusted medical equipment sat abandoned, but the air felt wrong, heavy and oppressive, like it was pressing down on her from all sides. And then, she saw it. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by her own body. But no. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, from one corner of the room toward her. Her throat tightened, and her skin prickled with cold sweat. The thing moved closer, its outline faint but unmistakable, and with each step, the cold deepened. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the shadow loomed over her, featureless but undeniably there. She couldn't scream. She couldn't run. She could only watch as it reached out toward her, its fingers, long and dark, brushing the air just inches from her face. And then, in a whisper, she heard, "Grace." The old ward remains locked now. Grace hasn't worked the night shift in months, not since that night, but sometimes, late at night when she lies in bed, she still hears the scratching. And in the back of her mind, she wonders, what if? The door opens again. Story 2. Red Tune. Samuel hated last-minute trips, but his job demanded them. His boss had always praised his willingness to go the extra mile. But tonight, as he sped down the dark, unfamiliar roads of Penang, that praise felt hollow. It was October. The city was crawling with tourists for the holidays, and after hours of fruitless searching, Samuel was beyond frustrated. He felt like he had checked every hotel on the peninsula. All his usual luxury resorts and boutique inns were fully booked. His sleek car hummed beneath him as he drove past the last hotel on his list. As he left yet another brightly lit, overcrowded lobby, driving aimlessly, then, as if by some cruel joke, his headlights illuminated a small hotel on the side of the road. It looked decent. Nothing like the upscale places he was used to, but right now, his standards were slipping. Desperation had a way of lowering expectations. He stepped into the lobby. which was oddly still. The receptionist looked up, their face pale under the dim lights, eyes vacant like someone who had long since gotten used to the silence of the place.
"I need a room,"
Samuel said, trying to mask the weariness in his voice.
"We're fully booked,"
the receptionist replied in a monotone voice, tapping at the keyboard. Samuel's heart sank. He had been turned away all night, and this felt like the last straw. The frustration bubbled to the surface.
"You're kidding me, right? How can every damn hotel in this entire city be booked?"
His voice cracked slightly, desperation bleeding into the tone. The receptionist hesitated, their fingers slowing over the keys before glancing up at him.
"Well, there is one room, but I wouldn't recommend it."
Samuel's brow furrowed.
"What do you mean you wouldn't recommend it? I need a room. Any room at all would do, please."
The receptionist's lips pressed into a thin line.
"It's adjacent to a decommissioned section of the hotel. It hasn't been used in years and—"
They trailed off, the hesitation only fueling Samuel's irritation.
"I'll take it,"
Samuel snapped, cutting them off.
"I just need somewhere to sleep. Please."
The receptionist sighed, sliding the key across the counter. Samuel snatched the key and walked off without another word, not caring about the cryptic warning. The hallway leading to his room was long and dimly lit, with carpets that felt worn and faded beneath his shoes. His room was at the very end, just next to a door that had been boarded up. He assumed it was part of the decommissioned section the receptionist had mentioned. But he shrugged it off. After all, he had a room, and that was all that mattered. The room itself was small but clean. Samuel dropped his bag on the floor and kicked off his shoes, already thinking about collapsing onto the bed. But as he began to settle in, a faint sound reached his ears. It was music, soft, melodic humming that seemed to float through the stillness of the hotel. Initially, he thought it might be coming from outside, but as he listened more closely, it became clear that the sound was far too close. Intrigued, he followed the melody, tracing it to the wall that separated his room from the adjacent supposedly decommissioned space. Frowning, Samuel pressed his ear against the wall, frustration bubbling within him. How could there be anyone in that room when the receptionist had explicitly told him it was abandoned? The more he thought about it, the more he felt scammed. Perhaps the receptionist had lied to overcharge him for a room in a half-vacant hotel. As he pressed his ear against the wall, straining to catch more of the faint humming from the other side, he noticed a soft glimmer of light escaping through a small opening just beneath the doorknob. Intrigued, he crouched down, discovering that it was an old, uncovered keyhole, likely a remnant from when the door had a different lock. The humming was clearer here, pulling him in with a haunting melody. He knew it was foolish, but curiosity got the better of him. Carefully, he positioned himself to look through the keyhole. In the dimly lit room beyond, he could just make out a woman seated on the edge of the bed, her back to him, with long dark hair cascading down her back. She was humming softly, her voice filling the silence with an almost hypnotic quality. Only part of her face was visible, but her profile alone hinted at an undeniable beauty. He couldn't look away, captivated by the sight and sound. But then, he accidentally pressed against the door, creating a soft thud that seemed to echo too loudly in the quiet rooms, his heart pounding as he realized the noise had betrayed him. In the stillness that followed, he noticed her head slowly beginning to turn toward the door. A spike of panic surged through him. Instinctively, almost reflexively, he pulled back from the keyhole, heart hammering in his chest as he backed up to his bed and sat down. He thought to himself,
"What was I doing? That was so reckless.
The humming had stopped abruptly, and now there was only silence from the other side. Minutes passed, but his curiosity gnawed at him. He reasoned with himself, trying to convince his own mind.
Maybe she didn't notice. Or maybe she left the room.
But the urge to check became overwhelming, as irrational as it was. After a moment, he found himself back at the door. Cautiously, he bent down and looked through the keyhole again, expecting to either see her, an empty room, or perhaps just darkness. But instead of a view into the room, he was met with something red. Something red was covering the hole. He squinted through the hole for several moments, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman again. But the red remained, frustrated and disturbed. He eventually stepped back and returned to his bed. No matter how hard he tried, he could not sleep that night. He woke several times, driven by an inexplicable need to check the hole, each time confronted with the same sight of red. The next morning, Samuel dragged himself to the lobby, desperate to leave. As the receptionist processed his checkout, Samuel couldn't resist asking.
Who was in the room next to me last night?
He asked, his voice hoarse.
I heard someone singing.
The receptionist froze for a moment, their face paling further.
No one's been in that room for years,
They said quietly.
That's impossible. I saw her. I heard her.
The receptionist gave him a strange look, then lowered their voice.
You saw her.
Samuel nodded, his throat tight.
A woman. She was humming.
The receptionist hesitated, but seeing the unsettled look on Samuel's face, they finally began to speak, their voice dropping to a near whisper.
In that room, it used to belong to a singer. She took her own life there, decades ago.
Samuel felt an uneasy chill creep over him, disbelief slowly turning into something else, something darker.
She was in love.
The receptionist continued, as if compelled to keep going, though they barely met his gaze.
She was madly in love with her boyfriend, but after an accident which left her horribly scarred, he couldn't bear to stay with her, so he left her.
Samuel's stomach twisted.
Scarred?
The receptionist nodded, their expression somber and distant, as if recalling a tragic ghost story.
Yes, the accident left half her face, ruined.
They paused, their voice softening even further.
And her eye on that side. It had turned completely red. People who saw her after the accident said her eye seemed to stare right through them, as if it carried all her pain.
A shiver crept up Samuel's spine as he listened, as her words sank in. A cold dread gripped Samuel. He suddenly realized what he had been staring at all night. Or rather, what had been staring at him. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed these two terrifying tales. If they gave you a scare, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more horror stories just like these. Let me know in the comments which one creeped you out the most, or share your own scary experiences. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and may the mysteries of the supernatural continue to captivate your imagination. This is Supernatural Secrets signing off.